The jungle is silent. Not the kind of silence that feels peaceful, but the kind that crawls into your ears and suffocates every breath you take. A young Japanese soldier sits in the back of an American transport truck, his wrists bound loosely with rope. His uniform is torn. His face is caked with mud and dried blood. He hasn't eaten in 4 days. He expects to die today. He's been taught since childhood that surrender is the ultimate dishonor. That capture means torture. That the enemy, these Americans, are monsters who will carve him apart for sport. So when the truck stops and the canvas flap pulls back, he closes his eyes. He waits for the bullet. But instead, he hears a voice. "Hey, buddy. You smoke." He opens his eyes. An American GI is standing there, maybe 22 years old, holding out a pack of Lucky Strikes. The Japanese soldier stares at the cigarettes like they're some kind of trick. Some cruel joke before the execution. The American shakes the pack. "Come on. Take one." The prisoner's hands tremble as he reaches forward. He takes the cigarette. The American lights it for him. And for the first time in weeks, the Japanese soldier feels human again. This isn't propaganda. This isn't myth. This is one of the most psychologically profound moments of World War II, a moment that shattered everything these men had been told about their enemies. And it happened thousands of times across the Pacific. So how did a simple gesture, sharing a cigarette, become one of the most powerful weapons in modern warfare? And why couldn't the Japanese soldiers believe it was real? August 1945. The Pacific War has been raging for nearly 4 years. Millions are dead. Islands have been turned into graveyards. The ocean is littered with the wreckage of ships and the bones of men who never made it home. For the Japanese Empire, surrender is not just strategically unthinkable, it's culturally impossible. From the moment a Japanese boy can walk, he's taught the code of Bushido. The warrior's way. Death before dishonor. Loyalty to the emperor above all else. To be captured is to cease being human. Japanese military training drills this into every soldier's mind. They are shown propaganda films of Allied forces committing atrocities. They are told that Americans torture prisoners. That they mutilate corpses. That surrender means suffering worse than death. So when Japanese soldiers are cornered, when ammunition runs out, when retreat is impossible, they don't raise their hands. They charge. They detonate grenades in their own foxholes. They hurl themselves off cliffs rather than face capture. On Saipan, thousands of Japanese civilians jumped from cliffsides, believing the Americans would rape and murder them. Mothers threw their children into the sea first, then followed. This wasn't fanaticism born from devotion alone. It was fanaticism born from terror. Because the Japanese imperial government had spent years constructing a narrative so powerful, so all-consuming, that death felt safer than surrender. But then something unexpected happened. American forces, particularly Marines and Army units in the island-hopping campaigns, began to notice a troubling pattern. Japanese POWs, when they were captured, weren't just scared. They were shocked. They were confused. They couldn't reconcile what they were experiencing with what they'd been told. Because American soldiers weren't torturing them. They were feeding them, treating their wounds. And yes, sharing cigarettes. At first, U.S. commanders didn't think much of it. Cigarettes were currency, comfort, a way to calm a prisoner down during interrogation. But intelligence officers started to notice something strange. The Japanese prisoners weren't just relieved. They were grateful. Deeply, emotionally grateful. Some of them wept. Some refused to believe it was real, convinced it was a trick, that the torture would come later. Others began to speak freely, offering information, asking questions about American life. And slowly, the U.S. military realized, this wasn't just kindness. This was psychological warfare at its most effective. Because every Japanese POW who survived, who was treated with basic human dignity, became a living contradiction to everything the Japanese Empire had told its people. And contradictions are dangerous. They crack foundations. They make soldiers hesitate. And in war, hesitation can mean the difference between victory and annihilation. So the question becomes, was this compassion? Or was it strategy? And does it matter? The Americans didn't set out to weaponize kindness. But they stumbled into it, and once they did, they realized just how powerful it could be. Let's go back to the early days of the Pacific Campaign. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Paliliu. The fighting is brutal. Close quarters. Personal. Marines are finding Japanese soldiers hiding in caves, starving, wounded, delirious with fever. Some are so far gone they can barely stand. Standard protocol is clear: disarm, detain, interrogate. But here's the thing about American soldiers in World War II: they're not professional killers. They're farmers, factory workers, college kids. Most of them have never left their hometowns before the war. And when they see a Japanese soldier, emaciated, bleeding, shaking with fear, something human kicks in. They offer water. They share rations. They light cigarettes. At first, the Japanese prisoners flinch. They expect violence. They've been taught that Americans are sadistic, that they'll burn cigarettes into skin, that they'll mock and torture before killing. But instead, the Americans just sit with them. Sometimes they don't even speak. They just smoke together in silence. And slowly, the prisoner begins to realize, I'm not going to die. Not today. Not like this. One Marine, interviewed years later, described it like this. We'd capture a guy, and he'd be crying, shaking, thinking we were going to cut his head off or something. So we'd give him a smoke, maybe some chocolate. And you could see it in his eyes, like his whole world just shattered. Like everything he'd been told was a lie. But here's where it gets interesting. The Japanese military knew this was happening. By mid-1944, reports were filtering back to Tokyo. Japanese officers were hearing from soldiers who'd escaped POW camps, or worse, from soldiers who didn't want to escape. Some prisoners were found actively helping American forces. Translating. Identifying enemy positions. Even broadcasting surrender appeals over loudspeakers. The Japanese High Command was horrified. How could their soldiers betray the emperor so easily? How could they be broken so quickly? The answer, they believed, was simple. The Americans were using psychological tricks. Mind control. Torture disguised as kindness. So they doubled down on the propaganda. They told their troops that the cigarettes were poisoned, that the food was drugged, that American kindness was a trap to extract information before the real torture began. But here's the problem with propaganda. It only works if the alternative is never experienced. And once a Japanese soldier experienced American treatment firsthand, once he realized he wasn't going to be tortured, that he was going to be fed, clothed, and sent to a POW camp where he'd live out the war in relative safety, the propaganda crumbled, and word began to spread. By 1945, something remarkable was happening. Japanese soldiers were beginning to surrender. Not in massive numbers, cultural conditioning ran deep, but enough that American forces started printing surrender leaflets in Japanese, promising safety, food, and medical care. Some leaflets even included images of Japanese POWs smoking cigarettes with American soldiers. At first, Japanese troops thought the photos were fake. But then they started seeing it happen. And everything they'd been told began to unravel. Let's focus on one man. His name was Private Yoshio Yamamoto, 23 years old. Born in a farming village outside Hiroshima. He'd been conscripted in 1943, sent to the Philippines, and within 6 months, his entire unit was decimated. By the time American forces overran his position in the summer of 1944, Yoshio was the only one left alive. He was hiding in a bombed-out bunker, delirious with malaria, his leg shattered by shrapnel. He'd made peace with dying. But then he heard voices. American voices. He gripped his rifle, but his hands were too weak to lift it. The Americans found him slumped against the bunker wall, barely conscious. One of them, a medic named Jack Sullivan from Ohio, knelt down beside him. Yoshio waited for the knife, the gun, something. Instead, Jack pulled out a canteen and held it to his lips. "Drink," Jack said gently. Yoshio drank. And then he passed out. When he woke up, he was in an American field hospital. His leg had been set, his wounds cleaned and bandaged. He was lying on a cot with a blanket over him. For a moment, he thought he was dead, that this was some kind of afterlife. But then a nurse, an American nurse, walked over and smiled at him. She handed him a tray of food: rice, canned fruit, bread. Yoshio stared at it. "Eat," she said softly. He couldn't understand English, but he understood kindness. He ate slowly, carefully, waiting for the trap to spring. It never did. Later that day, Jack Sullivan came by to check on him. He sat down on the edge of the cot and pulled out a pack of Camels. He offered one to Yoshio. Yoshio hesitated, then took it. Jack lit it for him. They sat there in silence, smoking together. And Yoshio began to cry. Not because he was in pain, but because he realized, for the first time, that everything he'd been told was a lie. The Americans weren't monsters. They were just people. Jack didn't speak Japanese, and Yoshio didn't speak English. But in that moment, they didn't need to. Over the next few weeks, Yoshio recovered in the POW camp. He was given clean clothes, regular meals, medical treatment. He was allowed to write letters home, though he knew they'd never be delivered while the war was still raging. And every day, American soldiers would stop by and chat with him, even though they couldn't understand each other. They'd share cigarettes, play cards, laugh. Yoshio couldn't believe it. He'd been taught that Americans were devils. But they treated him better than his own officers had. And slowly, something inside him shifted. He stopped thinking of himself as a prisoner. He started thinking of himself as someone who'd been lied to his entire life. By the time the war ended, Yoshio had become an informal translator for the American forces. He helped convince other Japanese soldiers to surrender. He even recorded radio broadcasts urging resistance fighters to lay down their arms. Some called him a traitor. But Yoshio didn't see it that way. He saw it as finally understanding the truth. And the truth was this: the war wasn't just fought with bombs and bullets. It was fought with cigarettes and kindness. And sometimes, kindness was the most powerful weapon of all. By late 1944, the U.S. military had figured out what was happening, and they wanted to weaponize it. Not in a cynical way, but in a strategic one. Because every Japanese POW who was treated humanely became a potential asset. They could provide intelligence, translate documents, identify enemy fortifications. But more importantly, they could undermine Japanese morale. The Office of War Information, the U.S. propaganda arm, launched a campaign called the Truthful Leaflet Program. They printed millions of leaflets in Japanese, dropped them over battlefields and occupied islands. The leaflets showed photos of Japanese POWs smiling, eating, playing baseball in American camps. They included testimonials from prisoners, written in their own handwriting, describing their treatment. Some leaflets had images of American soldiers handing out cigarettes. At first, Japanese commanders dismissed them as fake. But then something unexpected happened. Japanese soldiers started testing the leaflets. They'd take them to officers and ask, "Is this true?" And the officers couldn't answer, because they didn't know. Some soldiers began carrying the leaflets as insurance. If they were wounded or cut off from their unit, they'd wave the leaflet at American troops as a sign of surrender. And it worked. The Americans recognized the leaflets and treated the soldiers accordingly. But here's the critical psychological insight that the U.S. military discovered. It wasn't just about survival. It was about dignity. Japanese soldiers had been taught that capture meant total annihilation of the self. That they would be stripped of their humanity, tortured, and discarded. But when they were treated with basic respect, when they were given food, medical care, and yes, cigarettes, it restored something they thought they'd lost forever: their sense of self. And that was more powerful than any interrogation technique. Because once a prisoner felt human again, they wanted to help. Not out of coercion, but out of gratitude. Psychologists who studied POW behavior after the war called it cognitive dissonance collapse. The Japanese soldiers' brains couldn't reconcile the propaganda with the reality. And when faced with that contradiction, the propaganda lost. Every time. One intelligence officer described it like this: "We didn't break them. We just showed them the truth. And the truth did the rest." But it wasn't just about information. It was about humanity. Because the Americans weren't just winning a war. They were proving that even in the darkest moments, even when everything is at stake, you can still choose to be kind. And that choice, that simple act of sharing a cigarette, saved lives. On both sides. By the spring of 1945, the tide of the war was undeniable. Japan was losing. The firebombing of Tokyo had killed over 100,000 civilians. Okinawa had fallen. The Soviet Union had declared war and was steamrolling through Manchuria. And still, Japanese soldiers refused to surrender. But then, something began to shift. In the weeks leading up to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, American forces reported a strange phenomenon. Japanese soldiers were surrendering in small groups. Not because they were being overwhelmed, but because they'd heard from others, from POWs who'd been captured months earlier, that surrender didn't mean death. It meant survival. And more than that, it meant being treated like a human being. On Okinawa, American forces set up loudspeaker systems near Japanese defensive positions. They played recordings of Japanese POWs, in their own voices, describing their treatment. "I was afraid," one recording said. "But the Americans gave me food. They gave me medicine. They treated me with respect. If you are wounded, if you are tired, if you want to live, surrender. You will not be harmed." At first, the Japanese soldiers ignored it. But then, one by one, they began to emerge from the caves. Hands raised. Faces gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. And American soldiers met them not with bullets, but with canteens and cigarettes. By the end of the war, over 40,000 Japanese soldiers had been taken prisoner. Many of them later said the same thing. "We couldn't believe it. We thought we would die. But they gave us cigarettes. They treated us like people." And that simple act, that refusal to dehumanize the enemy, changed the course of history. Because when the war ended, those Japanese POWs went home. And they told their families what they'd experienced. They told them that the Americans weren't monsters. That they'd been lied to. And slowly, over decades, that truth helped rebuild Japan into one of America's closest allies. Not because of the Marshall Plan. Not because of occupation policies. But because of cigarettes. Because of kindness. Because someone decided that even in war, humanity matters. Yoshio Yamamoto survived the war. After his release from the POW camp, he returned to his village outside Hiroshima. His family had been killed in the atomic bombing. But he rebuilt his life. He became a teacher. And every year on the anniversary of his capture, he would light a cigarette and think about Jack Sullivan, the American medic who'd saved his life. He never saw Jack again. But he never forgot him. In 1985, 40 years after the war, Yoshio traveled to the United States. He wanted to find Jack. It took him 3 years, but he did. Jack was living in a nursing home in Ohio, 78 years old, suffering from Alzheimer's. Yoshio visited him. Jack didn't remember him. But Yoshio sat with him anyway. And they smoked a cigarette together. Just like they had all those years ago. Yoshio died in 1992. In his will, he left a letter to be published in a Japanese newspaper. It said, "I was taught that Americans were devils. But the devil who saved my life was named Jack Sullivan. And he showed me that even in war, there is still humanity. I hope my children and their children never forget that." Today, the story of Japanese POWs and American kindness is largely forgotten. But it shouldn't be, because it proves something essential about human nature. That even in the darkest moments, even when everything is at stake, we still have a choice. We can choose cruelty, or we can choose kindness. And sometimes, the kindest thing you can do is offer a cigarette to someone who thought they were going to die. War is hell. That's what they say. And it's true. But war is also a mirror. It reflects the best and worst of who we are as a species. It shows us what happens when fear and propaganda consume entire nations. But it also shows us what happens when a single act of kindness breaks through that darkness. The Japanese soldiers who surrendered in World War II weren't weak. They were brave enough to question everything they'd been taught. They were brave enough to choose life over death. And the American soldiers who gave them cigarettes weren't saints. They were just people who refused to let war turn them into monsters. Because here's the thing about humanity. It's fragile. It's easy to lose. But it's also incredibly resilient. And sometimes, all it takes to restore it is a moment of connection. A shared cigarette. A glass of water. A smile. These are small things. But in war, small things can change everything. So the next time you hear someone say that kindness is weakness, that compassion has no place in conflict, remember this story. Remember Yoshio Yamamoto. Remember Jack Sullivan. Remember the thousands of Japanese soldiers who couldn't believe that their enemies treated them like human beings. Because that's the lesson here. Not that war is good, but that even in war, we can still choose to be good. And that choice matters. It mattered then. It matters now. And it will matter for as long as humans walk this earth.